question about the relations between the United States and Iraq before the 2003 invasion of Iraq, U.S. invasion of Iraq, or even before the 1991 Gulf War. What was the relationship that led up to these two events that are really important in global history? Well, my guest for this has written a book on this very issue. It's Steve Coll. Steve Coll is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and also Dean Emeritus of the Columbia Journalism School. He's previously president of the Public Policy Institute, New America in Washington, D.C. He's an editor at The Economist in London, and he's the author of many books, many that we have talked to him over the years about. His latest book is called The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq. Steve Coll, it's my good pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you so much for having me.
You take on this question, which is an important question. I think a question that we sort of forgot after the invasion occurred in Iraq, of why wasn't Saddam Hussein more forthcoming about his weapons program, knowing the potential destruction that would come his way. And we're going to be talking about that whole dynamic. But let me just ask first, was he he did say he didn't have these weapons before the invasion, didn't he?
Repeatedly, loudly, insistently, and often attached to accusation. How can you suspect me of such things? That it just shows that you're not sincere and this is all a game, those sorts of things.
So the bigger question was around access of weapons inspectors?
Well, yes, it evolved over time, and Saddam Hussein was responsible for some of his own confusion. But I really like the way you started this, which is to ask the question that we didn't ask that much after the invasion and after the discovery that there was no WMD. Of course, that was a huge shock in the United States. It generated years of debate and controversy, investigations, journalism. And why did that happen? How did we go to war on the basis of weapons that didn't exist? Why was the war sold on the basis of weapons that didn't exist? All those questions. But as you say, there was another question, which was, why did Saddam create this impression or contribute to the creation of this impression that he had weapons when he didn't? And it ultimately cost him his regime, his long run in power, and even beyond that, his life. So, as you say, it's a complicated answer, and we'll have time to unpack it. But essentially what happened was that he did have these weapons during the 1980s. He used them in plain sight. He had the largest chemical weapons arsenal of any government since the First World War, and he used the weapons on Iranian troops during the war he fought with Iran during the 1980s extensively, more than, again, anybody had used chemical weapons since the First World War. And then he also used them against his own Kurdish population when they rebelled against him. So it was known that he had weapons. Then he invaded Kuwait. He was expelled from Kuwait. And in the summer of 1991, the United Nations, led by the US, but also with cooperation from the Soviet Union and China and other countries, imposed these disarmament obligations on Saddam as a price for his defeat and his recklessness. And the resolution basically said, you have to give up all your WMD. You have to come clean about the history of the programs you've had. You have to allow us to tear down any infrastructure that we think might be used to remake any of these weapons. And you also, by the way, have to give up missiles that could carry weapons a certain distance. And attached to these demands were punishing sanctions, economic sanctions. And so the only way Saddam and Iraq were going to have relief from economic devastation caused by these sanctions, as well as the damage of the war, was to pass inspection. And so in the summer of 1991, as the first teams of inspectors arrived, we now know something that was completely unclear at the time, which is that Saddam ordered in secret his son-in-law to go out and destroy whatever weapons he had in stock, chemical weapons primarily, but also some biological weapons, and then to cover up everything, the history of the programs and the facilities where they'd been made. Now you get to the obvious question, why did he do this in secret? It was because of, I think, three big things. One, he was unwilling to be humiliated in public by having this disarmament occur in plain sight. Swedish and Finnish technocrats in white coats standing there with clipboards telling the world that Saddam was now weaker than he had been and was no longer a dangerous threat to his neighbors. And pride was a big part of that. He eventually proved he'd rather go down in flames than be publicly humiliated in that way. And he said that in private to his comrades. The second factor was that linked, he was afraid that he would be vulnerable to attack, first by his enemies within, generals and restive coup makers, and then by his neighbors, Iran, with whom he'd fought a long war, and Israel, who he feared. And then the third factor was, and he said this again in private on these tapes that we can talk about later, that document kind of what he was thinking at various stages. The third factor was he didn't believe he was going to get any credit even if he cooperated. He was always telling his comrades who were urging him to cooperate, "You're naive. This is not really what they want. They want me gone. They want colonial possession of Iraq and its oil. They're saying that they want disarmament, but that's just their nose under the tent. And I'm not going to play their game."
Yeah. Tell me more about these tapes. You got access to these tapes. I guess that Saddam Hussein had made in high-level meetings secretly. He had these made.
Yes.
Yes. Similar to Richard Nixon's tapes.
Similar, although I think some of the people who were being recorded in his meetings were aware that they were being recorded, and I don't think that was generally true in Nixon's case. But yes, very similar. He tape recorded his leadership conversations, sometimes with his inner a sort of command group called the Revolutionary Command Council, longtime comrades in the Ba'ath Party, sometimes cabinet meetings, sometimes meetings with visitors, even obscure political visitors who might be granted an audience. And I was vaguely aware that these tapes existed and was curious about whether they might answer this basic question that seems like such an important part of our country's experience of the Iraq invasion. What was Saddam thinking? Well, here it is, a chance to answer that question, very rare with dictators of his character. And so I went looking to access the tapes and discovered they weren't publicly available. They have a twisted, long history that we can come back to if you're interested, but the short version is that they were partially released by the United States government, which possessed them, for researchers and scholars to use, and then they were withdrawn.
The United States got them from its invasion, and
exactly, yeah. The kind of task force that was looking for the weapons didn't find any weapons because there weren't any there, but they found a lot of these records and tapes, and at first they looked at them to see if maybe they would provide clues about where Saddam was, for example, because he was underground for 6, 7, 8 months after the invasion. But once they realized that there wasn't anything actionable, as the intelligence people would say, in the materials, that they were only of historical interest, they shipped them off to an air-conditioned warehouse in Qatar, and they hired contractors to start translating them and making sense of them, putting them into categories and so forth. And that work went on for years before the public knew anything about it. But then around, I want to say 2007, they started to release little bits and pieces of them selectively. And they set up a center still controlled by the Pentagon in a way. It was at a place called National Defense University, which is a place in Washington, D.C. But they did provide civilian access, and there were civilian historians working for the Pentagon who were in charge of them. And I think some good work came out from the early releases by independent researchers at universities and that sort of thing. And but then in 2015, they withdrew them all. They said it was for budgetary reasons, which may have been true in whole or in part, but it's a little bit hard to explain why they did this. And so when I came looking for them, it took me a while to figure out where they physically were. They were on a hard drive in the Pentagon in the office of somebody whose day job was to keep track of the Australian defense attaché at the Australian embassy. And so um, I had some experience with Freedom of Information Act requests as a reporter. And so in this case, I collaborated with a nonprofit in Washington called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And with their help, ultimately filed a lawsuit against the Pentagon. And we settled the lawsuit, and they gave me a big batch of the materials. And I acquired others by, other journalistic methods, source methods, that sort of thing.
But the Pentagon wouldn't give you all of them.
No, I mean, in fairness, on advice from my lawyer collaborators and from experience, I knew that it would be unwise to ask for everything, because then you give the government a reason not to provide you with what you're seeking. They'll say, oh, this is ridiculous. It's too much work, or we don't even know where everything is, and so forth. So I tried to fashion my request with specific batches of tapes and documents that I was aware of down to the index number. And I knew they had them. And I knew they couldn't run away and say, oh, well, we can't find them, or we're not really sure what you're asking for. You're asking for too much. It was a targeted request. I mean, I think ambitious. I got a lot of material, but that's why I did it that way.
Could you see another reason why would they want to keep more of these classified and out of the public sphere?
Well, it's a good question, to which we don't know the answer, because we don't know what we don't know. We don't know why. We don't know what hasn't been disclosed or what it reveals. I'm guessing that most of the highlights of what these tapes show about history and about what America missed, or interactions with the United States, that most of that is out there. And yet I can't be sure, because I haven't been able to look through it all, and nor has anyone independent of the government been able to do so. And has the government, if they found embarrassing materials in there, have they kept them and just kept them away from the public, or did they just drop them in the lake by accident, quote unquote, one day? Or, well, it may be a long time before we can be sure of that. But yeah, it's a shame, because apart from the centrality of the Iraq War and the invasion to American experience over the last 20 years, and the 20,000 soldiers, American soldiers who were wounded or killed in the war, and their families who might wonder what this was all about, or how did this happen, not to mention many other citizens who were affected by the war or concerned about it. There's really no reason to be hiding this material. You used the word classified. I started using that word when I was starting out, but then someone pointed out, well, actually, these are not classified, because they can't be, because they were not U.S. originated materials. You can't classify another government's files, no matter how sensitive they might be. Now, you can call them sensitive. You can withhold them on the grounds that they could upend U.S. foreign policy or something, but they're not subject to classification laws, which can be severe restrictions. And so in any event, apart from the Iraq story, which is important, vitally important, it's also so rare that you can study how a dictatorship like Saddam's works, and how decisions are made, how debates are held or not held. And in a world of rising authoritarianism, and with adversaries who live and decide in very closed systems that we, often are guessing about, I should think that scholars and researchers would, and even the people who read their work or are informed by it in government, would benefit from the chance to really wrestle with this material and argue about what it shows us, what it means. And none of that is happening because of this secrecy.
You begin the story that you tell in the Achilles Trap with the, generally speaking, around the time of the Iran-Iraq War. This is the early 1980s. Saddam Hussein comes to power in 1979. The Iranian Revolution happens in 1979. Tell me about this moment, this period of time, and why it's important.
Well, you just named one big reason. The Iranian Revolution upended the Middle East. Of course, the revolution displaced a close American ally and dictator, the Shah, uh, who had been a bulwark of American security strategy in the Middle East for 20 years plus. And um, he was, of course, followed after some turmoil and instability by Ayatollah Khomeini, who had a vision of an expansionist, politicized Islamist revolution, reflecting Iran's majority Shia strain of Islamic faith, and so he wanted to strengthen the network of Shia influence in the Islamic world. And he was quite political in his vision of how that might be done. Well, if you want to expand Shiism, the first place it's logical to look from Tehran is Iraq, because the majority of Iraq's population is Shia, but Saddam Hussein was not a Sunni strongman sitting, reflecting a sizable minority group in religious terms in Iraq, but again, nowhere near as numerous as the Shia majority. And so Ayatollah Khomeini started rattling his revolutionary saber at Baghdad, and Saddam took note of this. And he knew a lot about Ayatollah Khomeini, who had spent some of his period of exile in Iraq, and Saddam had in fact thrown him out. Those of us old enough to remember Ayatollah Khomeini's kind of triumph recall him arriving in Iran from Paris, where he spent the last part of his exile. But for many years before he was in Paris, he was in Iraq, and Saddam basically threw him out and sent him to France. So anyway, Saddam had Ayatollah Khomeini on his brain as the 80s began and as the revolution in Tehran took hold. And he decided, based on inaccurate information that he was receiving, that the Ayatollah Khomeini was weak, that factionalism in the regime meant there was an opportunity to knock it off before it could consolidate power. And so in September of 1980, he started a disastrous war without further provocation than just Ayatollah Khomeini's existence and verbal threats. He wasn't being attacked. Iran wasn't planning to invade Iraq. So Saddam waged his own preemptive war and thought that he could handle it quickly. Instead, his troops performed disastrously in the first weeks. They went across the border, got bogged down, and infamously, a World War I-like stalemate began to unfold that lasted until 1988, claimed 1 million lives, and ended in territorial terms where it began, with no gain by either side. So this disastrous war. And this, ended up configuring some of Saddam's thinking about the United States, because in 1982, the Reagan administration, looking at the war from satellites, panicked in the belief, based on what they were seeing, that the Iranians might be about to break through Iraq's defensive lines, drive on Baghdad, and overthrow Saddam. And as much as the Reagan administration had mixed feelings about Saddam, they certainly didn't want to see Ayatollah Khomeini expanding his reach. So they sent a CIA officer to Baghdad carrying secret satellite photographs of the Iranian positions. And the book kind of narrates how this happened. And the short version is that after that officer was received and the photos shared, the U.S. engaged in a secret collaboration with Saddam from 1982 right through the end of the war, in which it tried to advantage Saddam against the Iranians by providing him these exclusive satellite photos. At least the Iraqis thought they were exclusive, and the U.S. advertised them as such. And So that was, I think a lot of Americans probably, as the 2003 invasion approached, didn't know, didn't remember that we had such a long history with Saddam that we actually thought of him as a kind of ally for much of the 1980s.
There's that famous photo. I don't know if it was famous at the time, but it would be in 2003 of Donald Rumsfeld meeting with Saddam Hussein.
Yes, that was part of the attempt to collaborate with him. That was the overt meeting, I think the highest ranking official to ever meet personally with Saddam during that period, because the CIA people who went in generally didn't see him. They saw his intelligence people. But shortly after that Rumsfeld visit, this cooperation became a source of enormous disappointment and suspicion for Saddam, a kind of breach in his relations with the United States that really prefigures a lot of the conflict and misunderstandings that are to follow. And it went like this. I mean, throughout the time that the CIA was providing him these photos, Saddam, who was raised as a pan-Arab nationalist, anti-Zionist, anti-American youth in the cafes of Egypt during the era of Nasser and kind of proud, defiant pan-Arab nationalism and wars with Israel. That was his youth. His political beliefs were rooted in those years, and he never really shook them off. And one tenet that he had internalized was that the U.S. was the secret hand behind Israel, and that the U.S. and Israel were not so secret, the controlling hand, and that the U.S. and Israel were enemies of Iraq, and that they were secretly conspiring with Iran, with Ayatollah Khomeini, against him, against Saddam. So throughout this time, when his generals were looking over these satellite photos, he was saying to them, we can now see on the tapes, in essence, I don't believe these photos are real. This is just a trick. The Americans are the devil's agents on the face of the earth, and they're completely untrustworthy. And the generals would say, in effect, yes, boss, you're always right, but we can see over the mountain, and the things in these pictures are actually there. And it's actually very helpful for us to be able to see these things. So please don't cut off the flow of pictures. And he would say, okay, I hear you, but I'm telling you there's something wrong with this picture. The Americans have no real interest in helping us. So if the pictures aren't false, then they're probably providing the same thing to the Iranians in order to, lure us into a stalemate that weakens both countries. Now, that was not a crazy thought, as it turned out, because in 1986, the Reagan administration revealed what became known as the Iran-Contra scandal. And the Iran part of the Iran-Contra scandal was that Israel had persuaded the Reagan administration to secretly sell deadly anti-tank and other weapons to Ayatollah Khomeini to use against Iraq, and had provided Ayatollah Khomeini with substantial intelligence, the extent of which is still classified, but substantial intelligence, in the hope that Iran would use its influence to release American and allied hostages being held by Iranian proxies in Lebanon. And this scandal was a massive shock to much of the Arab world and to the United States. People ultimately went to prison. It consumed newspaper headlines for a year or two. And the funny thing on the tapes is the morning after this is revealed, Saddam gathers with his comrades and he says, I told you so.
Was it a shock to him?
Yeah, it was not a shock to him. He's the least surprised world leader. And also just kind of crowing about, see, I told you, you people are so naive. And what was important about it, apart from the betrayal that then undermined this, whatever potential there might have been for stability in relations between the U.S. and Iraq, which is a questionable proposition, but maybe not crazy to explore for the sake of peace. Besides the shock itself, was that it really stuck with him that what was revealed in Iran-Contra only confirmed his conviction about a deep and a permanent conspiracy among the United States, Israel, and Iran. And so later in the 90s, when war is on the horizon and these demands about disarmament are being pressed upon him, there are these debates in his private councils about how much he should cooperate. And he has diplomats and others who are influential in his inner circle who are saying, boss, of course you're a genius. We all love you. You can't be wrong, but maybe a cooperation would work. And we need to get out of sanctions. And this is the way to get out. And he would resist. And one of the citations that he would make in support of his arguments was, just remember Iran-Contra. That is the permanent state of affairs. And it's naive to think otherwise. And I'm not going to play their game again.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Steve Coll. Currently, Steve Coll is the editor at The Economist in London, and he's also the author of the book that we're in conversation about called The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq. Let's talk about the first Gulf War and then what led up to that now. Why did Saddam Hussein invade Kuwait to begin with?
It's a great question. I mean, it does have an answer that can be broken down maybe into two or three quick parts. First, he finished the war with Iran in a devastated condition. He had a large standing army that he couldn't afford to pay. Even though he had enormous oil supplies, he was in debt, and the country had been devastated by the human and material losses that it suffered in the war. And so he wanted money. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE had lent him tens of billions of dollars to fight the war. And he, not without reason, saw himself as their sort of mercenary figure. He alone had been able to hold the Iranian Revolution at bay. It threatened all of them, but he alone had paid the price for keeping Khomeini at bay. And his people had been the ones to bleed and die for that cause. Now, yes, they supported him with money, but now that the war was over, he went to them and said, you owe me more than you could possibly repay. So the least you can do is to turn these loans into gifts and forgive them because of what I've sacrificed on your behalf. And he said that with his usual menace and with an unsubtle hint that his hostility was not something they wanted to invite. The Saudis and the UAE quickly got the message and decided that it was in their interest. They were never going to get paid back anyway, they knew, and so they capitulated and forgave the loans and signed non-aggression pacts with him. The Kuwaitis held out, and I think people try to explain this by saying the Kuwaitis were, one person told me, they were meticulous bankers. They knew they weren't going to get paid, but they wanted the loans on the books. Other people thought that they were just negotiating with Saddam, holding out longer to try to maybe get a better deal than the Saudis had gotten by just giving in. In any event, they held out long enough for Saddam to start threatening war. And there was a historical dispute about the Kuwaiti-Iraqi border, indeed about Kuwait's independence that Saddam exploited as he began to put pressure on them. Now, at some point in the spring of 1990, as these threats were building up, Saddam made a private decision, we now know, to just go ahead and sack Kuwait, loot it, and incorporate it into Iraq. We can see him talking to his comrades. I mean, he's literally handing out auto dealerships to his cousins, like, you can have the Mercedes. He wants to make sure they bring back all of Kuwait's camels to Iraq, for example, and he has this list of what they're going to do. But meantime, he's saying in public that he's still open to compromise and that, this is an economic issue that could be resolved by economic terms. And as his threats increase and he starts to mobilize forces and move them toward the Kuwaiti border, which was essentially undefended. Kuwait was so small, so flat desert, and they didn't have an army that could stop Iraq even if they wanted to try. Uh, so George H.W. Bush, our highly qualified foreign policy president, starts to do what you'd expect someone experienced to do, which is he starts calling around to everyone who knows Saddam in the region, Hosni Mubarak, the leader of Egypt, King Hussein of Jordan, King Fahd in Saudi Arabia, people in the UAE. And you say, look, I'm worried. He looks like he's going to invade. What should I do? And they all say, don't do anything. This is just a bluff. He just wants to get paid. And if you start threatening him with consequences, you're only going to make things worse. You're going to aggravate him. Kuwaitis were first in line saying, don't do anything. In fact, they even refused any sign of military aid as a deterrent and refused to meet with the American ambassador because they didn't want to provoke Saddam by looking like they were turning to the Americans for help. So for all these reasons, Saddam never got a signal saying, don't do this, that he, could internalize. Nobody ever laid out for him what was actually about to happen after he invaded Kuwait, which was this massive military force was going to go to war with him over it. And so he went in.
So it wasn't clear that the United States. It wasn't clear that the United States was going to get involved if he invaded Kuwait. The U.S. ambassador at the time to Iraq was blamed heavily for not making that clear to him, wasn't she?
She was, although unjustly, I find, after going back and reviewing the material. You're right. I mean, it wasn't clear that the United States on its own would have the interest or the ability to go to war with Saddam if he invaded Kuwait. So that signal was never sent to Saddam. It wasn't clear because it wasn't clear who the partners would be. I mean, Kuwait was signaling they didn't want to get involved, and they didn't want to talk about what might happen if they were invaded and occupied. So there was no threat with local allies that could be credibly made. As a result, the position that the Bush administration took with Saddam was, we think border disputes should be resolved peacefully. And you seem to be threatening that you might use military means to resolve this economic dispute. That would be a violation of the UN Charter. That was the kind of language that was being written. Now, a woman who was the U.S. ambassador to Baghdad at the time, April Glaspie, leading Arabist of her generation, pioneering woman in the career foreign service, had been in Baghdad for a while, had been in the Arab world for longer, understood Saddam. Her cables about what he was like were among the most accurate documents I came across in 5 years of reading U.S. assessments of Saddam. But she was a professional diplomat, and so her job was to essentially carry talking points into any encounter with the Iraqi government. She was summoned by Saddam to a meeting, this infamous meeting where she was later accused of being too soft on him. But when she went into that meeting, we can now see, we have all the records on both the Iraqi and the American side. She was carrying talking points that were written to her by the Bush White House and by the Secretary of State, James Baker. I mean, these were very clear positions that had been written down and cabled to her repeatedly and that she had memorized. And she knew as an ambassador that her job in a crisis like this was not to like freelance and make up policy or threaten Saddam with war. That's the president's, job if such threats are going to be issued, but to instead memorize and deliver clearly the talking points that had been deliberated on and sent to her. And that's what she did. And they were the ones I just mentioned. They were kind of diplomatic speak for don't do this, but they weren't forcefully delivered and they weren't forceful in their nature. Now, afterwards, Saddam and his aides said after the controversy over her performance. They all said, in fairness, I mean, we'd already decided to sack Kuwait. That ship had sailed by the time that meeting occurred. All of this diplomacy was a kind of performance to suggest that he had only acted in desperation after trying all other possible means. But in fact, his plans were very advanced. The Republican Guard had already been notified that they were going in. And so even if she had been responsible for saying the wrong thing, it wouldn't have been material. But she wasn't.
The United States does end up getting involved in a war with Iraq over this. Is it, and it leads a coalition. I understand it's an international coalition that it leads, but it's leading it. Is it over oil? Is the issue for the United States access to oil?
Yes. I mean, I think you can say that. I mean, Kuwait still has among, if not the largest per capita oil reserves in the world. They were a substantial factor at that time in the world economy because of the ease with which their bountiful oil was brought to market. And there was a kind of a bedrock assumption in Washington and in Europe, Western Europe, that depended on oil to power its economy, that if there were a severe disruption to supplies, which had already occurred a couple of times in the 70s for different reasons, war with Israel, the Iranian Revolution, that could really set back the economies of the West. And maybe more threatening, if Saddam had all of his own oil plus all of Kuwait's oil, he'd already started two wars against neighbors without being provoked, seriously provoked. I mean, the Kuwaiti refusal to convert loans to gifts was maybe not a cause of war that anybody at the UN was willing to recognize. So the fear was that, if he had that oil, he would use it to build up an arsenal that could be quite threatening certainly to American allies and maybe, in some scenario to the United States itself.
The war,
without that oil, if it had just been a desert with no oil underneath it, I think the equation would have been very different.
Yeah. The war itself would make the United States a permanent fixture around Iraq, at least. Saddam Hussein massacred Kurds, Shias, Kurds in the north, Shias in the south. United States would, I guess through international means, but would be a major player in a no-fly zone. And then also out of this war comes these requirements for Saddam Hussein to rid of his chemical, biological, and weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, his nuclear program. Exactly. Yeah. And there was a lot that Saddam had been doing with chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons that was not understood until after he was defeated in the Kuwait War. The chemical weapons, which we talked about earlier, those were in plain sight, or pretty close to that. But his biological program was not well understood, and the fact that it had gone so far that he'd actually made shells with biological weapons in them and deployed them, though he used them only occasionally, wasn't known. And the fact that he had a 10-year-old secret nuclear weapons program led by a British-educated theoretical physicist who's a character in the book named Jafar Dia Jafar, who I spent a lot of time with, fascinating man, kind of the Robert Oppenheimer of Iraq. He, in secret, and without a lot of outside help, built up a nuclear weapons program that was on the verge of, at least enriching enough uranium to build a bomb. And I interviewed a lot of the scientists involved, and they debate about how close they were. But in any event, when the program was discovered after the Kuwait War by international nuclear inspectors, everybody in Washington and around the world was shocked at how far they had gotten without anyone knowing about it, and raised all kinds of questions about how that had been missed. That may have influenced some of the thinking prior to 2003. Well, we missed that one really badly, so we're not going to be fooled again. And so hard to assume that he wasn't doing something after that experience for some people.
We are approaching sort of towards the end of our conversation here, so I'm going to skip the story about Jafar Dia Jafar, which is regrettable. He was under house arrest, actually, by Saddam Hussein when he was ordered to create this program to develop a nuclear weapon.
Yes.
And like you said, you had you spent. He's still alive. Around
He is.
80.
Yeah. He still is.
Yeah. But as you said at the beginning of our chat, Saddam Hussein does destroy these weapons. And he does it in secret for many reasons, including which I want to return to. He believes the United States and the CIA specifically, and he's not alone in this kind of thought, already knew that he destroyed them because the CIA is so involved and infiltrated so many things. The CIA basically knows everything.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the implication of that is, well, they're making all these accusations day after day, saying I have stuff that the CIA must know I don't have. So what's going on? Well, it's a game to knock me out of power. It's just using WMD as a story to muster a war against me, and I'm not going to cooperate. And it hardened his somewhat, natural or lifelong instinct to refuse to cooperate with anybody who he regarded as an adversary. He wrote a book of aphorisms it's quite remarkable because it's basically advice for how to live in a world of deep conspiratorial enemies. And one of the principles that he exudes is like, don't think you can ever get along with your enemies. Just be realistic. They're out to get you. They're never going to stop. And any appearance of cooperation that they offer is just a game that they're playing to trick you. So don't be naive. And that was more or less the attitude that he brought to those years before the invasion. And it seemed to the U.S. and to its allies as further evidence that he was hiding things because he was so defiant. Why are you so defiant? And it was because he thought this was all a charade. CIA already knew the truth. And he also thought, in the tapes show him talking to his comrades, even in the early 90s, again, some of his diplomats are saying he should help these inspectors. He says, look, you don't understand. They already know we don't have this stuff, but also these inspections won't ever lead to sanctions relief because what they really want is for me to be removed from power. Well, in 1997, he was confirmed in that belief when Madeleine Albright, then the Secretary of State, delivered a speech for the Clinton administration in which she announced that U.S. policy was, doesn't matter if he disarms, we're not going to permit sanctions relief until he's gone. And once he heard that, within months, he threw all of the inspectors out, which, finally confirmed that there's really no reason for me to even pretend to play this game. And that blindness, the fact that there was nobody on the ground to look at things, only reinforced the fear that he had rebuilt his weapons when 9/11 arrived.
But others did know, or at least had a strong feeling that the weapons had been destroyed. UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter had claimed that these weapons were not there, and he was there in the 1990s. Even in the lead up to the Iraq War, we know that some of the intelligence we're all given in the media was cherry picked, but there was other assessments that put great doubt about Saddam Hussein having these weapons.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two leading inspectors between 2001 and 2003, Mohammed al-Baradei, who was running the nuclear watchdog agency, he came the closest to saying outright they don't have any nuclear weapons. And really, I don't even have any questions about their past programs that haven't been answered. Yes, they did have a past program, but no, it no longer exists. And there's no evidence that it's being kind of secretly tweaked or restarted. Then Hans Blix, who was in charge of everything except the nuclear program, he was a little bit less definitive, but as the war approached and he kept coming back to the Security Council, having to say, I can't find anything. Your intelligence agencies keep saying, look here, look there. I go to every address you suggest, there's nothing there. So I'm beginning to think there's nothing there. But he was kind of a politician in the way he approached it. He was under pressure from the US government and many governments to say what they wanted him to say. And so he played it right down the middle, I think. But if you read what he was saying, he was certainly indicating that there might be nothing at all. And he said that in private to world leaders like Jacques Chirac and Tony Blair. He said to Blair, it'll be ironic if you go in and there's nothing there at all. Have you considered that? Like, nobody was saying that to these people, I don't think, except for the international civil servants.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, and finally, I guess I'm just trying to get at, yes, I think Saddam Hussein wasn't forthcoming about his weapons programs for reasons that we pointed out. But I don't think you're making an argument here then that that the United States then had reason to believe he still had these weapons.
No, I mean, I think it was a catastrophic failure of intelligence and of understanding. I think what I'm hoping this book contributes, besides just enlarging our understanding of the history of this huge consequential turning point in our national experience, is to document how that failure unfolded, not only as bad intelligence tradecraft and cynical politics and propaganda and other things that are true about what happened between 9/11 and 2003 in the US system, but also just this absolute misunderstanding of the adversary, born of some of these complexities about the adversary's behavior, but also the fact that we didn't ever want to talk to him. We isolated him. We had no contact with him at all between 1991 and 2003. We missed the fact that in the weeks and months before the war in 2003, what was he doing? He was obsessed about writing novels in longhand at home. He wasn't preparing his great war machine. So these are the things we missed by isolating ourselves.
I know you listened to the tapes. Did you read any of the novels?
I did, yeah, in translation, one of them. I mean, they're really awful. Although I have to say, Zabiba and the King, which is the one that's fully translated in English, which is a kind of allegory. It has all sorts of ugly stuff in it, but at least it makes sense. You can understand what he's trying to do. Some of the other novels are just like endlessly turgid and unreadable.
Steve Coll, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Steve Coll has been our guest again. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. Currently, he's editor at The Economist in London, and he's joined us to talk about his book, The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq.